Welcome everyone to AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday, part of AURI Connect's monthly online series featuring updates on the work that AURI is doing to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products. I'm Dan Skogan, the AURI Director of Government and Industry Relations and your host on Webinar Wednesdays. The AURI Connects program is hosted by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute in Minnesota. This program aims to actively engage all participants in the food and ag industry to improve competitiveness of producers, businesses, and entrepreneurs through ongoing, purposeful connection of resources and partners along the value chain, and increase knowledge of opportunities, technologies, and trends. Remember, this event is being recorded and archived. Can be found at auri.org. Also remember that you will be muted during our presentations, but you can send us your written questions through the Q&A portal on your screen. Today, we expect to have a robust discussion about the aquaculture industry in Minnesota. What challenges are there, navigating the complex regulatory system, and how do we support and establish economically viable operations in the state? Our guests today are Harold Stanislawski and Carol Russell. Carol is the founder and CEO of Russell Herder, a strategic and creative firm located in Minneapolis. Russell Herder is an internationally certified B Corp, one of only 22 such entities in Minnesota that has met global standards for accountability, transparency, and social impact. Carol leads the firm's strategic practice, which is known for its work with regional and national clients across many sectors, including agriculture, education, healthcare, finance, manufacturing, and associations, among others. She has authored several key research studies with aquaculture and holds a master's degree and is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Executive Program at the Carlson School of Management. Harold Stanislawski is the Business Development Director for the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute. At AURI, he works with AURI staff and clients to further the development of agricultural commodities, co-products, renewable energy, food, and bio-based materials. Carol Russell and Harold Stanislawski, welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
Thank you, Dan, and it's a pleasure to be here today with our listening audience to talk about this topic of aquaculture today. And before we get into that, I just want to mention AURI's programs and resources overview just a little bit for our listeners to better understand what we do at AURI. I also want to mention that before we get started, there'll be a moderated panel Q&A question at the end. So the listeners out there, please post your questions in the Q&A box, and they will be monitored, and we'll get to those a little bit later in the program. A little bit about AURI programming. We are a nonprofit corporation created by the Minnesota legislature to increase utilization of Minnesota's rich agricultural resources. We work in 4 primary areas, that being food, co-products, sometimes referred to as byproducts by some off processing plants, bio-based products, and renewable energy. And in this work, we do 3 primarily effective things: commercialized services, which we work with private and one-to-one projects in these 4 areas, business, feasibility, hands-on technical assistance in our laboratories as part of this. We also have an entrepreneur in residence program where entrepreneurs can work in our labs and use our equipment and sharing to advance their projects. Public initiatives are free to the world. They're applied R&D for the industry, ag innovation partnerships to catalyze activity. And today, this Webinar Wednesday is really one of those initiatives that we started at AURI about a year ago. And now today, through our AURI Connects program, there's this part of industry convening, public dissemination of our research projects and reports. And today in our Webinar Wednesday, we will be talking about aquaculture in Minnesota. Some of our AURI guiding principles is to provide affordable access to consumer science, technical expertise, and infrastructure. And so this publication and information you're about to hear from Carol Russell is part of that effort. So AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday, every second Wednesday from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. You will hear an exciting program from our organization. So what we are discussing today is some work that we put forward through an initiative at AURI called Minnesota Aquaculture Opportunities and Challenges, to really try to look at Minnesota's future in the aquaculture sector. How can we, get this thing rolling here in our state, make it viable, and produce economic growth for our citizens and our people? So today I'm going to turn it over to Carol Russell, who Dan introduced, to talk about the first aspect of this report, which is the consumer survey results, which are part of a larger report to be released soon. So Carol.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you, Dan. Yes, I'm very excited to be here and to be talking about this. And as you just said, Harold, this presentation is going to be specific to the consumer perspective. There is a larger report that is coming out soon. And I really appreciate all of the experts in the field who participated in preparing that. This, however, has to do with the consumer survey that we did. I will say that the thing I really love about research is that it's a set of reliable facts, but more than that, it's also a story. Done well, research can tell us about where we've been, where we are right now, and where the opportunities are going forward. And I think that that's exactly what you're going to be seeing and what we're presenting. Next slide. Okay, so just a few things to set the landscape here. Globally, aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food industries, driven by technology, production, and a greater understanding and emphasis on the health benefits of fish consumption. I think everybody on this call is probably aware of that. It has, according to the FAO, aquaculture has served as a primary source of fish available, as opposed to only wild caught as it was long ago. As populations grow, experts say there's an even greater need for a sustainable source of protein. And that's another reason for this industry and its potential. Next slide. So the opportunity could exist for Minnesota's aquaculture industry to become an even greater resource for this. There is a lot of activity that's going on now, but as we'll be talking about, there is more that could be done. Positioning Minnesota aquaculture as environmentally friendly, sustainable, and healthy could really help a great deal. And we've got some information that is very specific to this. Next. I've got a few quotes in here, and they come from the larger report, but I think they're really relevant. This is from the Department of Agriculture. Minnesota's challenges will be our climate. How can we compete with warm weather states? There definitely are challenges here. But Minnesota does have the advantage of growing an abundance of fish feed sources like soybeans. So yes, there's challenges, but there's definitely opportunities. Next slide. Okay, if you look back at the history in Minnesota, we certainly have a rich history of fishing. We all know that, but it wasn't really until the 80s that interest in developing an aquaculture industry, escalated. I think it's important to note that extensive aquaculture, meaning fish raised in natural ponds at low densities, bait fish, sport fish, that has been happening, far before that time. But bigger businesses and food fish started to ramp up in the 80s. What that tells us is that what we potentially need now is innovation versus a brand new industry. We've had that all along, just different iterations of that. So there have been businesses. They've launched, but they haven't necessarily all prospered for a lot of different reasons, which the main report goes into. As consumer demand for locally grown fish appears to be increasing, though, there is a need for additional solutions to increase viability. Next slide. And a couple of quotes. Aquaculture is growing more worldwide than I've ever seen. This is from the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point. It's definitely here in the United States. I thought this was a really interesting comment. For the university students that we're training, again, in Wisconsin, we have people waiting to hire them. We really can't train them fast enough. So again, opportunity. Next slide. On a scale of 1 to 10, I think whether Minnesota deserves or should have an aquaculture industry is a 10. There's no reason it shouldn't happen here, and we need it here. There's demand. And this is from Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center at the U of M. Okay. All right. So again, what we're going to be talking about is that consumer perspective. Next slide. Let me tell you about the survey itself and the mechanics of it. You know, the intention of this was, you know, when we're doing the larger study, what we're looking at is we wanted to understand what do people in the field, the producers, government experts, et cetera, how do they feel about this industry? But it's really important to talk about the buyers too, because if there isn't a market for it, you know, it doesn't go anywhere. So our intent was to create actionable information for producers and related businesses and to identify consumer demand and awareness within Minnesota markets. You'll see there is opportunity there. And what are the purchase drivers to grow the industry? Okay, so to do that, we did a telephone survey that would assess market demand, current perceptions, purchasing barriers for food fish that was grown or sold in Minnesota. So we're talking, you know, food fish specific to this state versus other studies we have done dealt with consumer buying of seafood that came in from other places. This, you know, really deals a lot with Minnesota. We did over 350 interviews with adult Minnesotans by phone for a reliability of 5.3% at the 95% confidence level. And that was in late 2020. So what all of that means is that this is information that is reliable and is insightful and something that, should be dissected at a greater level. Next one. Okay, let's talk about purchasing behavior to start with. Okay, this is a slide from Cargill that I thought was very interesting. Which types of animal protein have you started eating more of in the past 5 years? Now, this is with US and UK consumers. So we're looking big picture. What are others seeing? 44% said fish. So there's a prediction there. It's more than it has been in the past. Poultry, beef, pork. Okay. Next slide. So what about Minnesota? And here is the first of the slides that I'm going to be sharing. This is again with Minnesota residents. The perception of what constitutes a healthy, sustainable food choice within the overall diet. If you look towards the bottom there, the blue bars, and you'll get used to seeing these colors throughout the presentation, mean very important. Orange is somewhat important, gray not at all important. So shrimp, people who felt that was a part of a healthy food choice, 51% said either very or somewhat important. Salmon, 65%, and other fish, 71%. So at this point, we were looking very broad-based into certain categories. Okay, next slide. And what about, consumer consumption frequency within the past year? So we want to know, are people eating any of these in the past year? Okay, so the blue bars here mean once or more per week. So chicken, beef, pork, they lead the list, which is perhaps not a surprise. But what we're seeing is 29% say shrimp, 25% other types of fish, 22% salmon. Okay, next slide. And this is actual purchase frequency, either fresh or frozen at a grocery store. Okay, not restaurants, just at a grocery store. Once or more a month, shrimp. Salmon is 40%, once or more a month, and other fish 40%. So you are seeing people buying this, which is a good thing. Okay, next slide. And what's important to these consumers? Okay, this is in descending order. Now, this is perception, of course. They said taste and flavor. And, think about it. If somebody is buying in a grocery store, they don't know that for sure. It's their perception of that. Food safety, a major factor. We did an exhaustive study on food safety for what was it, the National Food Defense Organization, and a lot of concerns about that. Of course, you've read a lot in the news. I'm sure everybody on this call has, about concern, especially food safety as it comes from offshore. Third, aroma and odor and appearance are a tie. Texture, nutritional value. Even though, people are talking more and more about wanting to have healthier food, that's midway down. Sustainability, price. So from a producer standpoint, it is perhaps encouraging to see price isn't number one. Ease of preparation and being Minnesota grown. Okay. Now this is slightly different. So the frequency of ordering fish, shrimp, or salmon in a restaurant. Okay, 21% frequently, 37% occasionally, 23% rarely, and 19% never. Now, if you had these slides next to each other, what you'd see is that more people say they are ordering fish, shrimp, or salmon in a restaurant versus buying it in a grocery store. That begs the question, why? And perhaps that is, and you'll see in an upcoming slide, they're not sure how to cook it. What we're seeing in other states is a concerted effort to teach people more about that. Most Minnesotans grow up learning how to cook more traditional things by their definition, as far as beef or pork, etc., but they may not know what to do with fish. Next one. Okay, would you be likely to increase your purchase of Minnesota grown fish? So in other words, what we're looking ahead now, what's the forecast? If it was available in a local grocery store or restaurant. So this is a really critical one for a producer. So 41% shrimp, 40% walleye, 37% salmon, and on down the line. So there is market increase that could go on here if they felt it was available and it was Minnesota grown. Okay. So what's the barrier? All right, if they're not buying it now, what's the barrier? And if you look down that list, I mean, some of those things, again, it's perception. So it would be consumer perception of, well, the quality is not quite where I want it, or the taste, or the smell, or the texture. Those are things that could be addressed through increased education, but it's not like somebody is necessarily trying it when they're in a grocery store. If you go to the next one, if you look there though, ability to locate and ability to cook it, those are not insignificant percentages. And so, back to what I was saying earlier about why are more people eating in a restaurant than they are, buying it in a grocery store? Well, you got 47% who say, I just don't know what to do with it once I get it. And you have 57% saying, I don't know where to buy it. Okay, so that's something worth noting. I mean, really only 28% are saying I don't like fish. Okay, industry awareness. Next one. This isn't something, and this is from Minnesota Sea Grant. This isn't something that is just done in Minnesota or the United States. Most of our seafood is imported. And if we can't compete on price with imported product, then we're going to have to compete for people's attitude towards locally grown fish, which I think is a very good point. So this one was very interesting. We were curious, which of these species of fish are commercially raised for food in Minnesota now? Okay, so in other words, what is the awareness? Walleye, there's an assumption that is trout, perch, tilapia, salmon, shrimp. Only 15% of people feel that is raised in Minnesota right now. Okay, so more educational opportunities could happen there. And that's, I think, a message to producers. If you are going to raise these species, there is a job to be done if you want people buying them, to be aware that it came from here. The next one. But based on what they know, And, granted, in many cases, they don't know a lot about what is happening within aquaculture in Minnesota, but based on what they know, what's their perception of the industry? This is in descending order, that it's good for the local economy. People do believe that it's a safe and clean method of obtaining fish. Now, see, that's interesting because if you remember back, food safety was a concern, for people, especially, fish that's imported, and they're feeling better about Minnesota grown. High nutritional value, positive impact on the environment. So that is a good thing, as opposed to some industries where there's a lot of concern. That it's more sustainable than wild caught. Okay. And what's the perceived benefits of Minnesota raised fish or shrimp? In other words, the previous slide had to do with the industry and the perception. This is about actually eating the product. There's a strong belief it's more sustainable, it's a higher quality. Do you remember quality was a concern, a barrier to purchase? Well, they're feeling, Minnesota grown fish probably is a good quality. It's safer, it's healthier, it's affordable. These are good, strong messages to be sending through if a producer wanted to sell more product, which assumably they would. Okay, let's dig into that safety perception a bit more. Okay, who do you trust to keep the fish sold in restaurants and stores safe? The blue is quite a bit, and that would be government agencies. That's not uncommon to feel that way. You can also see that they put a lot on grocery stores, also having a role in that. And I think, you're seeing organizations like Whole Foods or Lund's, they really understand that, and they're doing a lot with it on their websites and in the stores themselves. And commercial fish operations, there is a belief that, by 30% feel that that's, quite a bit of the responsibility is with the producers themselves. And 51% say, yeah, there's some role there. And the processors, and then of course, international fish farms, just not a lot of confidence there. Okay. So what are some opportunities we're seeing? Okay, this is an important question. Would you be willing to pay more for fish, salmon, or shrimp that benefited Minnesota's economy? 46% said they would. 34% said if it was raised in Minnesota, if they really understood that it was, they would pay extra for that. That's perception, of course, but it's a strong message. And if it's sustainably raised, they would pay more for that. This ties back to some of their priorities and some of what they were talking about in the purchase barriers. So I think, these are also strong messages to the industry that if you're going to have product and you're going to have it out there, some of this, like you think of Minnesota Grown, that program, as it relates to things like vegetables and all that, that's a strong message. Also relates to fish and the sustainability, but benefiting the state's economy is a message that maybe hasn't been told. It is a story opportunity there, and if that is the case, if it does benefit the economy, that could make a difference in price point long term. Next one. So among those who would pay more, okay, these are just those people who say, yep, I would pay more. But if you wouldn't buy it, if you still wouldn't, why? Quality, taste, and again, ability to locate. So 71% are saying, if I don't know where it is, I'm not going to be buying it, even though I'd probably pay more, but if I need to know where it's at. Okay, next slide. And, of course, when you see things like that, you wonder, okay, how interested are they in learning more about Minnesota's commercially raised fish? Now, we'd like to see 90% saying they want to, that is rarely the case. We have, what, 46% that are saying that they do have interest in learning. Again, not insignificant. It could be that those that don't have a lot of interest just don't know enough about it. Hard to tell. But those that are interested, those are the ones that we really want to pay attention to. The next slide. And where would they want to learn about it? That is also an important topic for anybody who is producing and selling. Google, very common, and they could choose more than one of these. At the place of purchase, again, you look at examples such as a Lund's or a Whole Foods. They do a lot on site to label products and to explain where they came from. As part of the larger study, I interviewed people from Whole Foods, and they have an extensive program where they're trying to educate people in their stores. News reports are important. Fish farm owners, they feel that that is where they'd like to learn right from the source. Government, social media. So all of those things play a role. Okay. And among those who would pay more, again, if we look at those as kind of a preferred near-term group, you know, number one is place of purchase. So that's where they're going to go. You know, that's when they're buying, that's when they're making a decision, that's where they want to see the information. We're also seeing Google as being high, news reports, government, etc. Okay, next one. And asking the question, you know, well, yeah, you say that you want to learn where you buy, but do you really pay attention to the labels when it comes to fish for other than price? We have 62% to at least some degree are saying they are reading that. They are paying attention. And that could be because they're not as familiar with this product too. I would, just my opinion, but I'm guessing that you probably see more label reading in this category than you would with some others. You know, it'd be they're trying to learn. Okay, next one. So, I mean, that was just a very high level view of things. So what do we see as recommendations based on this? And these are only recommendations based on the consumer study, not everything that is in the larger report that deals with infrastructure, et cetera. You got to educate, you know, advance awareness and understanding of the availability of the fish that is currently raised here and the benefits for it. That is something people, there is a degree of interest in learning more. And if we want to grow that market, people need to understand it. Accurately position aquaculture, the products and the operations as being environmentally friendly, a good source of protein, sustainable, energy efficient. Those are the boxes they want checked. You know, those are the things that are important to them. And also emphasizing the economic advantages of expanding the industry. You do see occasional stories in the media about this, especially from other states, but that would be something that would educate, especially that certain sector that is really paying attention to media. Next one. Communicating, you know, clear point of purchase information, you know, that has accurate and nutritional and source labeling and highlighting the health benefits. This is something that that Whole Foods, just as an example, has out there that talks about the fish that they sell as being responsibly farmed. You know, our product meets our quality standards. You know, they're doing this as a category, but this is the kind of thing that, and I guarantee you, they've done a lot of research on this topic and know that this is the kind of language and the kind of information that consumers are looking for. So they're doing part of it, but as you notice, they're not saying Minnesota raised, you know, it is in general farm raised fish. Okay. And having a centralized online destination that provides clear information about food fish products and how to cook them. There are a lot of examples out there. Well, and I shouldn't say a lot of examples. There are examples. Eat Wisconsin, for instance. If you want a fish recipe, they have them. You know, this is something that they are doing to advance the industry, and it appears to be quite successful. Next one. And, you know, part of this ties into, this is Eat Midwest fish. Consumers don't always know how to prepare fish like we talked about, and they eat it less often as a result. You know, you're not going to buy something especially if it's going to cost you a little bit more, and bring it home if you're not sure what to do with it. So there are sites out there like this one again that shows you, okay, you can either, like on this one, sort by the type of recipe or by the type of fish, but it's a very simplistic way of trying to increase awareness. Okay, next one. And promoting, raising the industry's profile about the economic potential. This is something that was in the Star Tribune about Wisconsin, and showing how there's promise for this, in this case, aquaponics in the Midwest. A lot of fish and seafood that's consumed by Americans is imported still and difficult to trace. This state could have a story here that would be one of a locally sourced protein with traceable water to table story behind it. So it could be a viable route to increasing awareness. Next one. And promoting and attracting investment capital. And some of this relates to the larger report, but it shows the dynamics and the opportunity in sector growth and increasing understanding of Minnesota regulatory framework for investment. Investment is important. This is one from the catfish industry, and it's showing people just, the value of the industry, the value of the product. Okay, next slide. This was a great quote from Carol Engel, who, as you know, is an aquaculture economist. Investments will be made where the opportunity exists. So her point is that, there are a lot of people in the industries that say, we would have a more viable industry if the money was there. And she's saying, no, the money will be there if the opportunity exists. It's a matter of framing the opportunity, defining it accurately, framing it up, and making the right contacts to make that case. Next. Okay, so that is a very brief overview. The next piece of this is going to be the industry perspective, which is equally important. If you go to the next slide, this just gives you a very, very, very high level overview of what is in that report. It's talking about what's going on with aquaculture from a global perspective. It's talking about trends. There are many people in the industry that are quoted within this. There are experts in the field on regulations, on nutrition, on disease control and detection. So actionable kind of information for the industry. The research that's underway right now, and there certainly are a number of studies that are happening. I believe Sea Grant is deep into an important study right now as an example. What the projections are for the industry in very concrete terms, and the opportunities in a greater depth. Again, I'm just showing you consumer perspective. This is showing you from the industry perspective, and more about consumer education and more in depth about the recommendations. Okay, so again, that is a quick overview, but all of this information that I was just presenting will be in the larger report along with other data. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Harold.
Well, thank you, Carol, and I really appreciate the great information there and the manner in which it was presented. I want to just alert the listening audience here that we do have a guest with us to help answer questions during our Q&A session. And his name is Sam Rose. He's the Director of Research at Food 21 out of Pennsylvania, and is a market and economic researcher for Blue Water Farms here in Minnesota. And I want to just make a shout out to Clarence Bishop, who is the CEO of Blue Water Farms, for connecting me with Sam. And Sam and I had a great conversation. So Sam, if you're on, maybe you could provide a little more input of who you are, and maybe make the first comments here on the presentation. And then we'll turn it to you, Dan, for the moderating of the Q&A. So Sam.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. And this was an incredible presentation. it definitely complements the research that we've done in blue water. So a tiny little bit about me is that I research and document and help attract investment for regional food supply chains across the United States. And that's how I got involved in the work with blue water. And really watching this presentation and the work that you all have done, one of the things I noticed is that we didn't have a chance to look into some of the consumer demand, but we did look at, and we're mostly looking at freshwater fish. So we didn't have a chance to look at saltwater species or shrimp. Although I think a lot of what I'm going to say would probably apply, but in the freshwater species world, we noticed that there's probably about 13 states that have a strong demand currently, and all of these things can be kind of couched in the reality that if someone does the education efforts that were discussed here today, that all of these markets can expand. But we thought we would just look at what is the actual like picture on the ground right now, the markets and where people are ready to buy the fish right now today. And so that's where we found there's about 13 states where people are really interested in freshwater fish, which usually is in and around the Great Lakes, probably not a surprise. Sometimes the inland South, and it's growing in the coastal areas where actually many people are migrating from the Great Lakes to coastal areas, and then they're bringing their preference for freshwater fish, but mostly in the Great Lakes region. And we found that even the current budget and projections that we found, depending on the species, could be anywhere from 20 million a year in those 13 states, all the way up to over 140 million a year that people are currently just now spending. And the best that we could find is that the production, whether it's fishing or aquaculture or any source, doesn't come anywhere close to that per species. That usually the supply is much lower than the demand. And so I think that gives like a simple context for how what was discussed here by Carol could actually feasibly grow this industry. The other thing that we found is that in our research, we found that people, either one of the problems is that the supply is not only of varying quality, but it's of varying quantity, so that if you're trying to base a product around a freshwater fish or something like that, whether it's in a supermarket or a restaurant, you can't get it year round. And so it's just going to be frustrating for you as a business. So we project that aquaculture products are of course going to be able to fill that void. So we feel like that's number one, is a slam dunk with trying to attract investment, because that you can literally talk to these largest businesses of the grocery store chains, restaurant chains, and they'll tell you this, and they'll tell you they're ready to buy some of these fish species if the quality can be better, if the quality of the supply, if the consistency of the supply can be better. But on top of that, for some of these freshwater species, they're still largely imported, not all of them. So it's a mixed bag. And I understand that most of our overall fish species are aquaculture produced, but there's still a big opportunity to do import substitution in the United States. There's a big opportunity to rebase a lot of that production in places like Minnesota, and it also would help the economic development of those areas. So I thought I'd share some of those simpler findings, just to kind of bolster the case that Carol made, and just basically reinforce the opportunity that for anyone that wants to invest in this space, there's quite a bit of room to grow, and there's definitely proven demand, at least from the research that we've done, and it seems that we found that AURI has found the same.
Thank you, Sam. Dan, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Harold, Sam, and Carol, both for your comments and presentations today. Carol, we're going to start with you, I think, because there was just a question about your particular survey, which was about the consumer for the most part. And they were wondering how many survey responses were actually collected. I think you touched on that early on in your presentation.
Yeah, just over 350. It was 352.
And were you talking about primarily freshwater protein, or did you include saltwater protein in there as well?
Depends on the question. Some of the initial results I was showing you, where we were asking, have you increased your purchasing of fish or of salmon. You know, that did include saltwater as well. But as we got further into the questions, we were very specific about Minnesota grown.
Boy, I heard a lot about convenience, about understanding the product, about preparation. I guess the question that comes to mind for me are those who are the producers of fish and fish products, not maybe spending enough time thinking about the end user. I mean, they know how to grow the fish. Is it critical here that they start to think more about who's going to be wanting that product? And Sam or Carol, either one, Harold, whoever wants to weigh in on that.
Well, I certainly have a comment on that. You know, you always have to think about the buyer. You know, that is very, very important. And I think this research gives a big picture guide to that. However, I think the ability for a singular producer to change the entire market is tough. And that's where you're seeing things like the Catfish Association or Wisconsin, what they're doing, you know, that as an industry, they're working together to do that. I think that's very important, but without education and increasing awareness, it's going to be really tough. We've worked in many different industries, and too often we've seen, and I'm not saying that's what's happening in aquaculture, but too many times we see the industry investing in and focusing on the infrastructure and all that, which is really important, but not thinking about the other side of it. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Sam.
Oh, I definitely do. We had a similar discussion where folks who are trying to increase healthy food consumption in general basically said the biggest barrier is either that the person doesn't know how to prepare the food, they don't have the support of their family. You know, there are demographics that are ready to jump in and buy this now and prepare it, and you could find and target them, but to grow and realize the full opportunity, it's definitely worth the education. And I think it would fit within the kinds of investments that people would make. And the cases of making itself, when I watched you make the case today, it's not hard to understand what's there and what could be in it for people. But the same challenge exists throughout the whole food system, just to confirm what you're saying. And so yes, I agree for sure.
Participant asks, how do you reconcile Minnesota grown being low importance among decision factors, but a high percent saying they would buy more if it's Minnesota grown? They say it feels like a bit of a disconnect.
It does look like that. I would argue that it's not. When you ask somebody, you know, what is really important to you when you're buying XYZ product, it's like what's top of mind. It's like those, you know, the things that initially come to mind. But when we ask the question, how important is it if something is Minnesota grown? So people, we're suggesting that, and they have to think it through. It's much higher, but particularly, I just want to underscore that was a really critical factor to people who are willing to pay more. And so that's, you know, that's really an important thing, especially in the near term.
Given that education of consumers is critical at the point of purchase, are there initiatives to work with local small businesses and food processors in Minnesota who do not have the resources of a national grocery chain?
Mm-hmm.
So is there work in progress to help make that connection?
It's, you know, it's a tough road. It's a really important point, because even in like talking to Whole Foods, for instance, you know, it's not easy to get product in the store there and to, you know, have them put their labeling on it, because they have a lot of standards and they have a lot of hoops that you have to go through. But I think for a small producer, there certainly are things that don't cost a lot of money. You know, dealing with the media, dealing with social media, having a website that explains your story, doing some things like that don't have to cost the big dollars. You know, I don't think there are a lot of producers who can do television ad campaigns. You know, there are fortunately ways that aren't as much, but again, I have to go back to the industry and what is the role of the industry. You know, you see those examples out there where states are very successful in selling their product. They have an industry behind it that is pushing it on their behalf. Because if we count on individual producers, it's going to be a much longer road, in my opinion.
Sam, any follow-up?
I'd love to follow up to just add that right before 2020, we saw that nationwide that the purchase of food away from home was substantially higher than food at home purchases. And of course, during COVID-19, we saw that actually reverse almost the same amount, and many people began preparing food at home. Now we're seeing again that the food away from home economy is trying to roar back, although the supply of the raw material for them is a struggle. But I bring that up to basically state that we shouldn't dismiss the reality that there could be a great market for aquaculture products in the restaurant and food away from home sector. And if someone is trying to create a business in this space, it's definitely worth looking at that. And that doesn't diminish or dismiss the reality that we should also educate people, get it in grocery stores and have it as a basic food staple. But also the reality is that you had people eating out like maybe about 5.9 times per week on average before COVID-19. And so there's definitely an opportunity to put it in front of someone who doesn't have the time to learn how to cook it on their own and prepare it on their own. There's definitely avenues there.
Dan, if I can chime in here a bit, I think the Minnesota Aquaculture Association is looking at this very strongly about how they can help promote fresh fish in Minnesota. And, you know, in other commodities, we have checkoff tools of which then provide funding to help promote the product. And I think over time, as an industry grows, a checkoff on aquaculture will probably be a very smart thing to do, because that will help promote the product and advance the industry.
Carol, back to your survey. How were the survey respondents chosen?
It was a random sample within certain demographics. So it was adults, for instance. We weren't talking to 15-year-olds. It was adults statewide, you know, all income levels. So it was random within that.
And then both Sam and Carol maybe could comment on this if you've done any study on it. But is there any data on current commercial aquaculture production in Minnesota, different products available, where it's located, where we can find it, some of the things that consumers were looking for?
You know, we delved into some of that in the larger report, but it's always a changing landscape. So we don't have a real thorough look at that, but we do assess how the industry is doing at this point.
And I would add that in the research that we did through Blue Water, we can summarize it by saying that the supply is well below the known demand. So we don't actually publish data on that internal research that we did, but that's a reassurance we can give people that want to know about this, is that there's plenty of opportunity for aquaculture production in Minnesota versus what currently exists, even though we're aware that there are many that are doing it.
I think we have go ahead. I think we have a question to that point, Harold or Sam, either one, but they're wondering if you have much information on hatcheries, nurseries, grow out businesses. Is it a robust enterprise in Minnesota yet, or is it coming, or where are we at?
Sam, go ahead first.
Okay. Well, Minnesota is the #1 place for some of these production of some of these freshwater fish species. And I didn't know that until I started looking into it. So yeah, Minnesota is either in the top 10 or at the forefront in what you just mentioned. A lot of it being sponsored by the state government.
And I know in the case of a lot of the startups in the aquaculture industry, these kinds of activities are being born now in our state, and they're starting to develop. We at AURI have been involved in a little bit of that, and it's been fun to see it incubate. And I think you're going to see a lot more of it, because it's a revenue stream that you can get generated even before you get into the food fish grocery marketplace, because there's a market for the fingerlings, or whatever.
I think we've got a number of growers and a number of consumers both on our webinar today, which is great, because we go back to the survey. You suggested about 33% of consumers willing to pay more. Did you ask how much more? Is there a price break where the interest starts to drop away?
That's a very good question, and I'm sure is coming from somebody who really understands research well, which I appreciate. We did not ask that in this particular study. We did in a previous fish and seafood study, and so we have that information that I can certainly forward to somebody. But in this one, we were looking more for just overall perception. It's going to vary. The response to that is going to vary by species. It's a much more in-depth road to go down. And so we did not have the time to do that in this particular study, but it's an important one that absolutely should be followed up on.
And then Sam and Harold, you know, in the production process, there's going to be a waste stream, or we like to call it co-product stream at AURI. Have we given thought to the added value there of turning that either through the processing of the fish or through even the growing of the fish? Is there an opportunity for another revenue stream?
Yeah, there sure is. And we at AURI have been involved in that. And some things come top to mind here. And one is pet food, the pet food market that certainly we have a rather dynamic pet food industry in the state that has already expressed an interest in a lot of that co-product material. And then the organic composting and fertilizer business is another big one where folks have a great interest in that because there's pretty high nitrogen in it, and that can help stimulate the organic products in those areas. So those are really good. And Sam, I'm sure you see some of the same things.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, but everything you're saying are things that we're looking into those as a possible augmented revenue stream for any aquaculture. And really anyone that is going to think about getting into aquaculture probably should try to look at as many alternative revenue streams from the one production as possible. So definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, Dan, I just want to mention that those that might be interested in further study on those byproducts and co-products should contact us at AURI, because we can help characterize those streams and help identify which market might be best. So certainly call us.
Sam, you're in the process of growing out a business here. What's a barrier? What's something that keeps you guys up at night now that you guys are facing that needs to be overcome? And then give me the crystal ball. What does your industry look like in 5 years?
Well, there's, you know, I'll start from where you started from, that the biggest barriers that I can understand are now in the execution, depending on the species. So getting these facilities up and running, you know, I think attracting investment is less of a barrier, given that you can see the case that can be made, and we feel like we've got a solid case for the commercial opportunity. And I think we've even got a solid case that this is going to grow over time. Our projections show that even just from the time series of how this has grown over the years, how seafood consumption has grown, and other sources also indicate that the overall consumption of seafood is projected to grow, and the overall consumption of freshwater fish is projected to grow in the United States, and the overall production of aquaculture is projected to grow. So that puts us in a good space to raise the capital. Our biggest barrier now is actually to getting up and running and succeeding in the challenges around the production of these species. I think that blue water is definitely up to that task. And I guess I kind of answered your question a bit with a crystal ball about where we think we're going to be. But I did some extensive work trying to project in dollar amounts how much this could grow. And with some species, as I mentioned, it could get into over $140 million level or higher, just from the projections that we could do. But right now, the production is not coming anywhere near that. It's let's say it's $8 to $10 to $12 million a year in value of production. So over the next 5 years, if you had people actually doing the production and investment in this space, you could easily see it grow to that level. You could easily see it grow from a 10 to 12 million a year to up to 100+ million a year, depending on the fish species. I think, you know, the biggest risk area, kind of like in agriculture, is really the production. If you plant crops in the ground and they fail, that's a big risk. And if you're growing these live fish, you've got managing that and making it work is the biggest risk for anyone in the stage that we're at now. So that's my answer for you.
Perfect.
Dan, just one thing on the investment side. Just recently, we've been very fortunate to been actually contacted by investment entities kind of around the country that are starting to examine these kinds of opportunities. So I felt that was a really good positive step, and we are going to be networking with companies like Blue Water Farms and others to try to connect those two, and they'll work out the details.
And given that, Harold, I'll give you the final word of the day before we close things out today.
Well, I just want to thank Carol Russell and her firm for the great work that they did. It was gratifying to see everything that's done, and I want to encourage the folks to read the full report that will be available on our website, because that's got a lot more of the details. And then Sam, for a quick draw McGraw here, called you last week, and you're able to join us, and that's really great. You bring a lot to the table, and I want to wish you and Blue Water Farms all the success that we can muster here in Minnesota. And I want to thank all of the folks who are investing in our state with shrimp and freshwater fish. We want this thing to succeed, and oftentimes these facilities are connected to aeroponic facilities as well. So these are good opportunities for our state. Should be no food deserts in Minnesota when we get all this done. And I like fish. Dan?
All right, Harold. Thank you so much. That concludes AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday for today. We do want to thank Carol Russell, Harold Stanislawski, and Sam Rose for their presentations and participation today. AURI Connect's Webinar Wednesday is presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. AURI's mission is to foster long-term economic benefit for Minnesota through value-added agricultural products and processes. We're interested in your feedback as well, so please respond when we send you our event evaluations. Remember, for more information on today's program or any of the work that AURI is involved with, you can go to auri.org. Now, next month, August 11th, please join the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute, Northern Crops Institute, and Back When Foods to learn about efforts to identify value-added uses for AURI from Minnesota's only tofu manufacturer, Min Tofu, in research funded by the Minnesota Soy Research and Promotion Council. This webinar will describe the research that's focused on fermentation to improve both the hedonic and nutritional profiles of okra as a baking ingredient in traditional and sourdough breads. You can always learn more about other work that AURI is involved with by going online at auri.org. Looking forward to having you join us again August 11th for another AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday.